Thank you. And to Count Corlett, 10 of the 20 questions that the Taoiseach was responding to are in Deputy Adams's name, so please bear with me. I don't think there's many harvests been taken in Ringsend and Pearse Street. Deputy Humphreys looked a bit puzzled by your, what's his name? Would he Guthrie? Yeah, no, I've heard of him. No, before my time, Taoiseach. So Taoiseach, obviously that development that you've described around the J1 visa is worrying. You might just set out for us exactly what you have done about it so far by way of engagement or representation. But as worrying as that is, it is, however, secondary to the longer standing and deeper concern for the undocumented or for people who have overstayed various visas in the United States. And I know that this is a matter on which the House is united in looking for a resolution. But what I'm not clear on is, outside of your visits to the United States, particularly on the occasion of St. Patrick's Day, what's the rhythm of your engagement on this issue? How regularly do you personally, or does your department, intervene and interface with members of the Senate or the House of Congress, or with the Ambassador himself here in Dublin? I'd just like to have a sense of how that works. Can you also set out for us the supports that are afforded by your administration to those groups that you say incessantly, I would say tirelessly, work on behalf of the undocumented stateside? I very warmly welcome the remarks that you make in respect of fairly vile commentary in respect of immigrants to the United States. And indeed, Taoiseach, it's not just ourselves as an immigrant nation that understand that phenomenon, but of course the United States is itself built on the immigrant experience, not just from our own shores, but indeed from further afield. So I very much welcome that. Can I ask you, on the occasion that you met with President Obama, did you have a discussion with him in respect of the current refugee crisis, the Syrian crisis? What was the content of that exchange? Can I ask you also what discussions you may have had in respect of the Stormont House Agreement? The negotiations are, as we know, underway. But you will know, and I think you have acknowledged, Taoiseach, that the North is a special case in very many respects, coming out of a period of very protracted conflict. I think all of us support and have understood the concept of not just peace, but a peace dividend in economic terms. Will you, Taoiseach, press for the restoration of the block grant budget that has been stripped of £1.5 billion sterling? This is something that looms large in the current negotiations. Will you have you pressed for a workable budget for the institutions? Will you honour your own commitments, for example, in respect of the construction of the A5 motorway? Did any of these matters form part of a discussion that you had with the President of the United States? Taoiseach, question 29 relates to human rights lawyer Pat Finucane, as you know, shot dead in front of his wife Geraldine, who was also shot, and their children at their home in North Belfast on the 12th of February 1989. I think you'll agree with me when I say that Pat's family are to be commended for their courage and their diligence, and indeed their stamina in demanding a public inquiry into this killing. The trauma and stress they've experienced is made all the greater because of the intransigence of the British government to honour a commitment freely made at Weston Park to hold a public inquiry. In 2001, as you know, Taoiseach, the British government agreed with the Irish government to invite Judge Peter Corey to determine the need for an inquiry. He concluded that there ought to be one, and yet the British government have refused to implement the Western Park agreement.
Sorry, what question are you on about?
Question 29.
Oh, we're at 1 to 19 is what we're on.
Or are we? My apologies. This is a matter I know that you've raised previously and has been raised very consistently in the United States of America. I'd like to know if it formed part of your discussions with President Obama on the occasion of your last visit, which at this stage is some time back. And finally, Taoiseach, what about TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, a comprehensive free trade and investment treaty currently being negotiated between the European Union and the USA, and a very, very controversial proposition at that. Did you discuss this matter with the President? Did you raise the real threats that this would represent to our democratic institutions, our standards, our public services, our workers and our agricultural sector? Did you raise any of these concerns, Taoiseach, with President Obama?
Thank you. Taoiseach.
Thanks very much. You've raised quite a number of questions there, Deputy. Well, as I say, I expressed the view, Concordia, that I think the potential diminution in J1 visas would be a serious blow to connections between Ireland and the United States, and for the opportunity for so many young people to legitimately work in the US and avail of that wonderful experience for young people. Yes, we have regular reports, Deputy MacDonald, from the consulates in the States and from the ambassador, and I have to say that Ambassador Anderson is a very dedicated official who's in constant contact with different political personnel on the Hill, as they say. I meet with Ambassador O'Malley here on regular occasions at different events, but this has to be done on the far side, and this requires the politics of the United States to deal with comprehensive immigration reform. If there are 15 million people or more, and they're in the United States illegally, you know, some candidates say they're going to send them all away. This cannot happen, and so in those people's lives, it would be far more beneficial to the US and its economy and its future by being legitimised and being able to have legal status and contribute to their own lives and to the business of the United States. I might say that in Congress, the current consensus on Capitol Hill, Deputy, appears to be that the next opportunity for a push on comprehensive legislation reform on immigration is not likely to arise now until 2017, and that's after the presidential election. So the use of immigration as a negative, emotive issue in the Republican presidential nominee race only adds to that particular message being reinforced, which I regret. In the interim, the Irish Embassy in Washington is pursuing a strategy for E3 visas for Ireland, with the intention of taking advantages of any opportunity to move forward on immigration legislation that might present itself. I can't say that it will. Now, as I said to Deputy Naughton, Minister Flanagan was in Washington last week. He met with Congressman Sensenbrenner, which announced that a bill had been tabled by him that could provide for the reallocation of thousands of E3 visas for Irish participants. However, it has to be said that that's only the first step in a long and difficult and complex process, which has to be navigated if this act were to become law. Yes, I did speak to President Obama about this matter, and obviously he has been limited in what he can do, and he's done what he can do. Minister Flanagan met with Vice President Biden on the 30th of March at the opening of the Edward Kennedy Institute, and he emphasised Ireland's continuing concerns in regard to immigration reform, and in particular the importance of the travel issue for the Irish undocumented. We're all aware of this. If you can't come back for a family event or for a tragedy or for an unfortunate whatever. And that's an issue that's of serious concern to us here. He also had, as I had, meetings with Speaker Boehner. Speaker Boehner reiterated on the 2nd of July that this was a matter he'd been working on for several years. It was difficult to secure progress, but he would keep trying. He spoke on the need to make progress in immigration reform at the American Chamber when I addressed that the following day. I spoke on that myself. So Mr Flanagan met with all of those people I've mentioned, Ryan, Neil, Sensenbrenner, Joseph Kennedy III and so on. There are a sizable number of visas allocated to Australia under the E3 system. There are 15,000. It's less favourable than a standalone provision for Ireland. So that's being pursued, but I'm not sure how the connections between Australia and the US would view a situation like that. At his meeting with Minister Flanagan, Congressman Sensenbrenner said that it would be necessary to have a bill of that sort passed by the Senate first before a bill could be passed in the House of Representatives. He explained that many Republicans, including Chairman Bob Goodlatte of the House Judiciary Committee, would be concerned that such a bill might be added to in the Senate by those wishing to broaden its focus to more than general immigration reform issues, and that it was necessary to deal with those fears first if the bill was to get anywhere. However, he also indicated that he was ready to table the bill in the House of Representatives immediately, which he did the following day, while making it clear that action to move it forward would have to wait on progress of the Senate, so you can see the complications. Now, Congressman Sensenbrenner is a very experienced operator. He's well regarded on the immigration issue in Republican circles. The sponsorship of the bill is positive. A great deal of work now is to be undertaken, though, and his bill will remain on the books until the end of the legislative session, when, if not acted upon, it will fall. So that's obviously a possibility. E3 visa, US-type visa, available to Australian citizens since 2005. It allows for 10,500 Australians to travel and work for a year in the US for up to 2 years, where there's renewable indefinitely as long as the individuals have met the eligibility criteria and have a valid job offer. Spouses and children of visa holders can also travel. On the basis of reciprocity, Australia offers a similar scheme to US citizens. Then there's the whole question of visa waivers. On the 24th of February, on instruction from Minister Flanagan, a letter was issued from the Department of Foreign Affairs to a US Ambassador O'Malley on the wider issue of US immigration reform, as well as on the question of waivers. And this letter inquired whether it would be possible to create a predictable and a positive pattern for waiver approval within existing US regulations. Minister Flanagan subsequently met with the Ambassador and discussed this issue with him on several occasions. I raised this myself during my visit to Washington on St. Patrick's Day. Now, the US Embassy have indicated that the waiver system is applied in strict accordance with US laws and regulations and is operated uniformly worldwide, including here. An application for waiver grounds of inadmissibility, as this is known, is an application for legal entry to the US made by an individual who is otherwise inadmissible on one or more grounds. Such a waiver can be applied for in the case of a 3 or 10-year ban having been imposed for overstaying a visa in the US in the first place. Now, the US Embassy has underlined that applications are assessed individually on a case-by-case basis, with final decisions on each being a matter for the US authorities in Washington, and that accordingly an applicant would not be able to predict with any degree of certainty as to whether they would be successful or not. While this response is very disappointing, ultimately it is a matter for the US government and the US Embassy to interpret and to implement their own immigration laws. I mentioned to President Obama in respect of Northern Ireland and the situation that applied. I didn't actually discuss the A5 with him, or the Narrow Water Bridge, or the Ulster Canal, or a number of other issues. But I did say to him that obviously we would continue to support, where that's possible, these pieces of infrastructure. Now, we've had money in place for the A5 for quite a number of years, Deputy MacDonald, but it hasn't moved to a point where that's been drawn down because of legal problems and court cases and so on. So I think it's important to determine what actually is required here, how much is involved. I think we've had 50 million sterling over a couple of years. It's been there, and it hasn't actually moved from that point. If I recall correctly, we did discuss the implications of Stormont. I've always defended the Finucane family, and Geraldine Finucane in particular, in respect of our call, backing a call for a public sworn inquiry in this case. I might just add for your information that today government approved the retrieval of information facility, which is part of the Stormont House agreement, and that, in theory at least, would lead to a person looking for information relevant to an issue or an incident or an event in Northern Ireland and it being made available to them. It remains to be seen whether that will actually apply in practice or not. The theory here, Deputy MacDonald, is that irrespective of where the blockage was in the past, that an independent person would make the information sought available to the person seeking it. If it's pertaining to themselves or their families directly. So that will require heads of legislation coming through from Britain and from here. And the intention would be that both governments would sign this element of the Stormont House Agreement into effect on the same date. Obviously, it will take some time, I think, to put the two houses, the two parliaments, to deal with it, and it needs to be compatible, so that if there's a request either way, that this would be made available in respect of Northern Ireland. You mentioned, yes, I mentioned to him, we didn't discuss the question of the extent of migration, except to say that the situation in the Greater Middle East was extremely fragile and very sensitive. The literal flood of migrants across the Mediterranean and through the Eastern European countries wasn't evident at that stage to the extent that it became evident afterwards. And obviously the United States have made comments and taken some action about this. Clearly the current situation insofar as Syria is concerned with both Russia and the United States in there at the moment is causing both confusion and has led to a tragedy in a MSF hospital with conflicting reports of how that actually came about. So I think that deals with most of the situation.
Call in Deputy Boyd Barron.
Finally, I might say, Cancorda, the question that you raised of the block grants and all of that, we're precluded from, under the strands of the agreement, in respect of involving ourselves in that. We did go to Stormont prior to Christmas, and eventually there was agreement on the agreement, including the responsibility being accepted by the politicians in regard to welfare reform and the elements of money that were involved there. And Prime Minister Cameron responded to that in his own way. Obviously, the situation drifted downwards afterwards, and I'm glad that at least there's now a focus again by the political representatives on moving it forward, and I hope it does. I'd say very finally, Cancorda, I met with former President Clinton in New York when I was there for the United Nations, and had a very good meeting with the President. And I might just say that obviously he's well aware of Senator Hart being appointed as envoy to Northern Ireland, but he has a passionate interest in Northern Ireland over his many years' experience here, and while not wishing to become, centrally involved, he has said that in any way that he could assist or offer advice, that's available as a general element of the process. Cancorda.
Thank you. Deputy Boyd Barron.
Thanks, Cancorda. Taoiseach, you said earlier on that I think the words you used were unhelpful or uncomfortable, some of the language that's been used by presidential candidates in terms of immigrants in the United States during the election campaign. Could I just ask you whether we don't need to just be a little bit more forthright in roundly condemning the language of one particular candidate, Mr. Donald Trump, who has been condemned by governments, by civil rights organisations and human rights organisations for using what can only be described as despicable language, utterly despicable and racist language. He accused Mexico of exporting its rapists, I'm quoting him, its rapists and criminals to the United States. He has, and this is very relevant to the undocumented Irish, he has called for the expulsion of all 11.3 million undocumented workers in the United States. Now, Taoiseach, this is the same Donald Trump that Minister Michael Noonan met in Shannon Airport in May of 2014 with a red carpet and harps and people dressed in traditional Irish dress, in what was frankly, even at the time, a quite ludicrous show of deference to this multi-billionaire. But this same person now turns out to be somebody who is literally whipping up an outrageous and dangerous, Taoiseach, dangerous hysteria against the undocumented, which include the Irish undocumented. Now, I just really ask myself, one, do we regret rolling out the red carpet for a man who would say this about immigrants in the United States? And are we going to condemn what he is saying? Because he will hear those words. Given his investment in this country, it will be something he will hear if the Irish Taoiseach, the Irish political system, condemn him utterly for the words that he's used to describe immigrants, wherever they may be from, undocumented immigrants in the United States. So I would ask you to respond to that, and indeed to make that forthright condemnation. Because when somebody is being racist, and that's what he's being, and whipping up dangerous hysteria, where there's serious reports of immigrants actually suffering heightened levels of violence and threats and racist stereotyping, specifically because of the language and rhetoric that Donald Trump has used. It is emboldening the worst and most racist elements in the United States to attack, target, vilify, demonise and physically attack, in some cases, undocumented immigrants, mostly directed at Mexicans, but he said he wants to expel all undocumented workers from the United States. Can I also ask Taoiseach whether, in the context of the refugee crisis, and particularly the situation in Syria, and how that has been one of the major centres from which these refugees are fleeing, did you, as we asked you to back earlier this year on a number of occasions, did you raise criticism, questions, concerns about the United States' own role in creating the conditions for this refugee crisis, through their actions in Iraq, through their support for Saudi Arabia, through their arming of these regimes, who have then gone on in turn to finance, support, give succour and create the conditions for the rise of ISIS? Somebody has to start saying this stuff, Taoiseach, because the consequences have been so devastating. And lastly, Taoiseach, you mentioned your attendance at the UN meeting in New York. Can I ask you, I've heard an unconfirmed report, and I'd just like a straight and direct answer, did you meet or have any engagement with General al-Sisi, the president and dictator, there's no other word to use for this man, of Egypt? Did you have any engagement, or did any of your officials or any representatives of the Irish state or political system meet General al-Sisi, the man who is engaging in mass executions, mass trials of his own citizens, including Ibrahim Halawa? And if you did you raise the case of Ibrahim Halawa, whose trial has been deferred yet again 2 years incarcerated in prison.
That's a separate issue to what you're asking
But it relates to what the Taoiseach mentioned about his attendance at the meeting in New York. So I'm asking, did you meet General al-Sisi in New York, or did any of your officials or anybody have any contact or engagement with him? And if they did, was the issue of Ibrahim Halawa raised?
Taoiseach.
Thanks. Thank you, Deputy Boyd Barrett. I regard the comments made by candidate Trump as being absolutely outrageous. And I condemn them unreservedly in the context of immigrant people. We have 70 million people ourselves worldwide who claim Irish ancestry. Many of those were deported. Many of those left because of economic circumstances. Many left because of colonisation and the consequences of the Great Hunger. And it's something that's very deep in the Irish. I commend again our naval personnel who have taken from the waters of the Mediterranean over 7,000 people, men, women and children. I think in life and in politics, Deputy Boyd Barrett, sometimes you have to meet people with whom you disagree. Sometimes you meet people with whom you have very wide differences of opinion. Kennedy met Khrushchev, Reagan met Gorbachev, the Pope meets Castro, or whatever. I won't. No. The fact that Minister Noonan met a visitor to our country down in Shannon doesn't preclude Minister Noonan from having very strongly differing opinions about comments made by Mr. Trump in respect of immigrant people. This matter of Syria, Deputy Boyd Barrett, has been discussed at some considerable length at European Council meetings also, where the bigger countries in Europe have made and taken action in respect of the opposition in Syria to the Assad regime. We've discussed this before here, and everybody is of the view that the Assad regime should go. The latest intervention between Secretary of State Kerry and Mr. Leprov from Russia on how ISIS are to be dealt with in Syria obviously is a case in point, but the hundreds of thousands of people who are displaced and who are living in camps both in Jordan and in South Lebanon and are trekking across into Turkey and from there into Europe speaks for itself about this absolutely devastating issue. So we spoke of the European position here and the need for action to be taken to end this war. We have another situation in Libya where there's no government either, and where now you have open season from the Horn of Africa moving through to Europe. Finally, I might say to you, you mentioned, yes, I did meet with the President of Egypt and had a meeting with him for 30-40 minutes with Minister Sherlock, with officials. Spoke to the President about Ibrahim Halawa and made it very clear and without any equivocation of our desire that this young man should be able to return home to Ireland here. Minister Flanagan has had detailed discussions on this in the last week. I also made it clear, however, that we cannot change the judicial court system in any other country. And I discussed very clearly with the President the question of the eligibility once the system would be through of a presidential pardon for Ibrahim Halawa. I left the President in no doubt of what our request there is, and that a presidential pardon should be considered and should be granted so that this young man could come home.
Thank you.
Obviously, in speaking to the President, I wasn't aware at the time that the trial would again be postponed because of the illness of two of those who were on trial. But I can confirm to you, I did meet with them, formally with the officials, minutes are taken, and along with Minister Sherlock, and we also discussed the quality of the developmental programmes that Ireland does in sub-Saharan Africa, and he expressed himself interested in learning more about those in view of the number of immigrant people and refugees taken into Egypt over the last period.
Thank you.
But I can send you a report of the meeting which is very clear, Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Thank you. That completes questions to our Taoiseach.